I can't sleep anymore without a heavy dose of Klonopin. The silence of the night is the worst part. It reminds me of that other silence, the one in the middle of the ocean, a silence that was shattered by a sound that froze my blood and made me sell my boat, the Morning Star, for pennies on the dollar. I was a lobster fisherman off Cape Cod, Massachusetts, spent 30 years at sea. I've seen storms that could swallow a small town, waves the size of buildings, and the relentless fury of the Atlantic. I believed in currents, weather patterns, and schools of fish. I didn't believe in ghosts. To me, sea ghost stories were just tall tales to spook greenhorns, drunk talk in portside taverns. My crewmate, Bill, a Vietnam vet who claimed he'd seen it all, and I used to laugh at that stuff. The sea was dangerous, sure, but it was a physical, tangible danger. What we saw that night, though, wasn't on any nautical chart, in any weather forecast. It was a horror that latched onto us and never let go. It was an August night, almost too calm. The sea looked like a mirror of black oil under a starless sky. We were about 40 miles offshore, a spot we knew like the back of our calloused hands. The boat's engine hummed low, a comforting sound. That's when the VHF radio, tuned to channel 16, the emergency channel, started to crackle. It wasn't the usual hiss of static. It was something more organized. At first, we thought it was interference from another vessel, but then the sound became clearer. It was crying. A child's cry, desperate and high-pitched, cutting through the stillness of the night. "Daddy, Daddy, it's cold," the little voice said between sobs that sounded like they were coming from the bottom of a well. Bill went pale. I grabbed the radio. "This is the Morning Star. Who is this? Repeat your position. Over." Silence. And then the crying again, closer now, as if it were right outside the cabin. We went out on deck, the salty, humid air suddenly feeling ice cold. There was nothing on the radar. No boats, no debris, nothing. Just the vast, dark emptiness. And the crying continued. Now without the radio, echoing over the water. It was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Bill, the man who faced hell in Vietnam, was shaking, clutching a crucifix he always wore under his shirt. We started hauling our lobster traps as fast as we could, our hands clumsy and trembling. The sound wouldn't stop. It was torture. It felt like the child was right there, next to us, suffering, and we couldn't do anything. It was a feeling of helplessness and dread I'd never felt in any storm. The sea, our workplace, our livelihood, had suddenly become a haunted tomb. I remembered a news story from 2 weeks prior. A family from Boston, the Clarks. Their yacht sank in a sudden squall. Husband, wife, and their 7-year-old daughter, Sarah. They never found the bodies. The yacht's name was Sarah's Dream. In that moment, it all clicked. It wasn't interference. It wasn't a prank. It was her. Bill started vomiting over the side of the boat. I just wanted to run. I pushed the engine to full throttle, ignoring the risk of damage, and pointed the bow toward the coast. The crying followed us for nearly a mile, then vanished as suddenly as it began, leaving us in a deafening silence that was 1,000 times worse. The image of that little girl, alone and cold in the darkness of the Atlantic, is seared into my mind. We made it back to port before sunrise. We didn't say a word to each other. We just tied up the boat, grabbed our gear, and left. The next day, I put the Morning Star up for sale. Bill moved to Arizona, as far from the ocean as he could get. I've never set foot on a boat again. Every night, when I close my eyes, I still hear her. "Daddy, it's cold!" And I know that no matter how many pills I take, the ocean has saved that voice just for me, forever. I'm not afraid of storms or waves anymore. I'm afraid of the silence and what it might bring back from the depths.
I need 3 different kinds of pills to get anything resembling a night's sleep. One to knock me out, one to keep me from dreaming, and a third to keep me from waking up screaming. It's all because I saw a body floating in the Gulf of Mexico that shouldn't have been there. Not like it was. My name is Carlos, and for 25 years I was the captain of a shrimp boat, La Suerte, sailing out of Port Fourchon, Louisiana. I knew the warm currents, the dangers of hurricanes, and the tricks the heat and light play on your eyes at sea. I'd seen dolphins that looked like mermaids, and the glow of plankton that turned the night into an underwater sky. The sea was my world, and I respected its power, but I didn't fear it superstitiously. What I found about 100 miles offshore on a sweltering, windless afternoon changed all that, and turned me into a man who's afraid of his own bathtub. The sea was as flat as glass, the sun a hammer of fire in the sky. My first mate, a young guy named Dave, was at the helm while I checked the nets. He's the one who saw it first. "Captain, something in the water! 1 o'clock!" I grabbed the binoculars. It looked like a log or a large piece of debris, but as we got closer, the shape became unmistakably human. A body. Standard procedure, unfortunately common in that area. Notify the Coast Guard, mark the position, and, if possible, recover the body. But something was wrong. He was floating on his back, arms outstretched, like he was relaxing, and he was riding very high in the water. Bodies that had been in the sea for a while get bloated from gases, but this one looked normal, slim even. When we pulled up alongside him, the horror began to set in. He was a white man, maybe in his 40s, wearing only a pair of ripped denim shorts. His skin was pale, almost translucent, but it wasn't wrinkled from the water. There were no signs of decay, no evidence of being picked at by fish or seabirds. Nothing. He looked like he'd just fallen in. The most terrifying part, though, was his eyes. They were open, wide open, a glassy blue, and they seemed to be staring right at us. Not the empty gaze of death I'd seen before. This was a fixed, conscious stare. Dave refused to get any closer. As captain, I had to do the dirty work. Using a boat hook, I pulled the body nearer. The cold coming off it was unnatural, a chill that seemed to suck the heat out of the humid Gulf air. With great effort, we managed to hoist him onto the deck. That's when all hell broke loose. As soon as the body hit the wood, a smell rose up. It wasn't the smell of death, of rot. It was a smell of ozone, of the air after a lightning storm mixed with a sweet chemical odor like formaldehyde. And his eyes. I swear to God, his eyes followed Dave as he moved to the other side of the deck. There was no life there, but there was observation. I got on the radio and reported it to the Coast Guard. I described the body. From the description, they identified him as a tourist from Ohio who went missing from a cruise ship 6 months earlier. 6 months! It was impossible. A body in the Gulf of Mexico, with its warm temperatures and marine life, wouldn't last 6 days, let alone 6 months. It would have been picked clean to the bone. We covered the body with a tarp and headed for shore in absolute silence. We could feel that stare penetrating the fabric, watching us. Dave was crying softly in the corner of the cabin. I couldn't get the image out of my head. That man, perfectly preserved, floating like a cork with eyes that saw right through us. When the Coast Guard took him, one of the officers told me to forget what I saw. "Strange things happen at sea," he said. But this wasn't strange. This was a violation of every law of nature. I sold my fishing license the following week. I moved to inland Texas. Sometimes, when I'm in the shower and I close my eyes, I feel that unnatural cold and see those glassy blue eyes staring at me from the dark. The man who wouldn't sink, sank me for good. I used to love the fog. For me, an old crab fisherman on the Oregon coast, fog was part of the job. It would wrap my boat, the sea serpent, in a silent cocoon, muffling the world and leaving us alone with the sea. Today, I can't even look at the steam from my shower without having a panic attack. The fog isn't a blanket anymore, it's a shroud. And in that shroud, I heard things that weren't human, and I saw things that shouldn't exist. I'm on antipsychotics now. The doctor says it's post-traumatic stress disorder. I know it wasn't trauma. It was contact. Contact with something that lives in that gray soup, something ancient and hungry that uses the voices of the dead as bait. The king crab season is brutal and dangerous, but it pays the bills. We were near Tillamook Head, an area famous for its treacherous rocks and sudden fogs that can disorient even the most seasoned captain. There were 3 of us on board, me, my son Kevin, and a greenhorn named McGill. The talk at the port was about a group of 4 college kids who had vanished while hiking the coast about a month earlier. They found their tent, food, everything, but no sign of them. The theory was that the tide had caught them in a cove. Tragedies like that happen. We mourn, but life goes on. The sea always collects its toll. We had no idea we were about to find out just how high that toll was. The fog rolled in without warning, a dense white wall that cut our visibility to less than 30 feet. We cut the engine, switched on our navigation lights and foghorn, and waited for it to pass. That's when we heard it, a faint cry. "Help!" It came from the direction of the rocks. I immediately thought of the students. Maybe one of them had survived, gotten trapped somewhere. We grabbed the radio, tried to make contact, but all we got was static. The voice came again, clearer this time. "Please help us! We're trapped!" It was a young woman's voice, terrified. Kevin, who always had a soft heart, was already getting the inflatable dinghy ready. I hesitated. Something felt wrong. Acoustics are weird in the fog, but the voice sounded hollow, like there were no lungs behind it. I decided to maneuver the boat slowly toward the sound. It was risky, but we couldn't ignore a call for help. "We're so cold, please!" Now it was a male voice. The voices started to overlap, faint, desperate. Miguel was at the bow with a spotlight, trying to cut through the fog. "Captain, there's something in the water," he yelled. We aimed the light. Floating on the surface was a red jacket, identical to the one worn by one of the missing female students in her last known photo. And next to it, an arm. Just an arm, torn off at the shoulder, the flesh pale and covered in strange bites, not from a shark. They were small, almost surgical marks. Panic began to bubble in my chest. The voices grew louder. "Come and get us!" But now they had a different tone. They weren't pleas for help anymore. They were invitations. And the sound was distorted, like a cassette tape being chewed up. A wet, guttural sound bubbled underneath the words. "It's a trap," I whispered. Miguel, frozen with fear, kept the spotlight on the water. And then we saw it. For a split second, the fog parted and the beam of light illuminated the base of one of the rocks. It wasn't a person. It was a thing, pale, long, with limbs that bent at impossible angles. It was half submerged, and what I thought was hair was actually a mass of thin, dark filaments writhing in the water. It raised one impossibly thin arm, tipped with fingers long as needles, and waved. And from its head, which had no face, just a dark slit, came the perfect voice of the female student. "I'm over here. Come on." I screamed at Kevin to start the engine. The roar of the ignition seemed to enrage the creature. A sharp, inhuman shriek cut through the air, and the thing dove, leaving a trail of disturbed water. We reversed course so violently the boat nearly capsized. We didn't look back. We just sped away, tearing through the fog, praying that thing wasn't fast in the water. The voices followed us for a while, shifting from pleas to angry, incomprehensible whispers, until we finally broke through the fog bank and into the sunlight, which had never felt so sacred. We reached the port, made up some story about nearly hitting the rocks, and never spoke of what we saw again. I quit fishing, sold the sea serpent. Kevin moved inland and works in agriculture. Miguel didn't make it. He had a nervous breakdown a few months later, and they say he still screams about the faceless woman in the psychiatric hospital. I know he isn't crazy, because every time the fog rolls into my town, even miles from the coast, I lock my doors, shut my windows, and listen. And sometimes, very faintly, almost imperceptibly, I can still hear a whisper on the wind, an invitation to come back to the water, an invitation from the thing that waits in the fog.
People talk about the Bering Sea like it's hell on earth. 50-foot waves, winds that can peel the skin from your bones, ice. To me, it was just a job. I was the chief engineer on the Kodiak Queen, a state-of-the-art trawler for 15 years. I knew the sound of every bolt, every piston on that vessel. The constant roar of the engine room was my lullaby. Now, silence terrifies me. After what we found adrift near St. Matthew Island, I traded the rumble of a 3,000 horsepower diesel engine for a padded room and the soft voice of a therapist who thinks my visions are a product of extreme isolation. He's wrong. What I saw was real as the ice that encased it. We were in the middle of a paleo crab season, a grueling and dangerous job. The weather was unnervingly calm, which in the Bering is a bad omen in itself. The sea was a greasy gray and the sky looked like a slab of concrete. The sonar picked it up first, a large surface contact, no AIS transponder signal. It wasn't responding to radio calls. The captain, an Icelander named Lars, decided to investigate. Could be a boat in distress. As we got closer, we saw it was a fishing vessel, but an old wooden model, something you didn't see in these treacherous waters anymore. Its name was barely visible on the hull, Winter's Bite. The name gave me a chill. The Coast Guard had no record of a vessel with that name recently lost. The boat was dead in the water. No lights, no smoke, no sign of life. But the strangest thing was the ice. It was coated in a thick, unnatural layer of blue-white ice, far thicker than the weather conditions could account for. The ice covered everything: the deck, the cabin windows, the stacked crab pots. It looked like an ice sculpture, a floating tomb. Lars, against my advice, decided we needed to board. The rules of the sea are clear. You render aid. He, myself, and 2 other crewmen, Javi and Mac, took the skiff over. The silence was absolute. Our footsteps on the frozen deck sounded like gunshots. The cabin door was frozen shut. We had to use a fire axe to break it open. What we saw inside will haunt me until my dying breath. The crew, 4 men, were in there, frozen solid, but not like men who died of hypothermia. They were frozen in poses of absolute panic. The captain was clutching the wheel, his mouth open in a silent scream and his eyes wide with terror, staring out the front window. One crewman was huddled under the chart table, his hands clamped over his ears. Another was on the floor, his fingers dug into his own throat. And the last one was standing, pointing toward the ship's hull at an area near the waterline. His finger was inches from the wood, and his face was a mask of indescribable dread. The air inside was so cold it hurt to breathe. There was no sign of a struggle, no damage to the boat, except for the ice. We found the captain's logbook on the table, open to the last page. The handwriting started out steady and devolved into a frantic scrawl.
The last few entries spoke of a sound, a low song coming from beneath the ice. At first it was beautiful, hypnotic. Then it began to change, to get inside their heads, showing them terrible things, their worst memories, their deepest fears. The captain wrote that the crew was going mad, attacking each other, screaming about eyes in the ice. The last, barely legible sentence was, "It's not the cold, it's the song of the silence. It's inside the..." The sentence was incomplete. That's when Javi screamed. He was looking where the frozen man was pointing. On the wooden hull, from the inside, were marks, deep scratches. But they didn't come from the inside out. The wood fibers were pushed inward. Something on the outside, under the water and the ice, had been trying to get in, not with brute force, but with a chilling precision. And as we stared at the marks, a sound began. Low, vibrating, a single note resonating through our own hull, a melody that felt like it was crawling up your spine and scratching the inside of your skull. The song. We didn't wait for orders. We scrambled out of there, jumped in the skiff and rowed like madmen back to the Kodiak Queen. Lars was screaming into the radio to the Coast Guard, babbling about a ghost ship. They didn't believe us, of course. They said it was probably an unregistered Russian vessel that succumbed to the cold, but we knew the truth. We left the Winter's Bite behind, a silent tomb in the gray sea. I resigned the moment we hit port. I live in the New Mexico desert now, but it's no use. At night, when everything is quiet, I sometimes hear it, a low hum, a faint melody, the song of the silence. And I know that no matter where I run, the Bering Sea remembers my name.
I'm a practical man, or I was. My name is Sam, and for 40 years I chartered my boat, the Real Time, through the Florida Strait, hunting marlin and tuna. I've seen waterspouts dance on the horizon and the green sky before a hurricane. I knew the legends of the Bermuda Triangle and always laughed at them. To me, they were just excuses for bad navigation or mechanical failure. I believe in facts, in evidence. The problem is, the evidence I found aboard the yacht's Serenity doesn't fit into any facts known to mankind. Now, I can't look at the night sky anymore. I'm afraid of what might be looking back. My psychiatrist gave me a diagnosis of agoraphobia with a touch of psychosis. I call it clarity. We got a call over the marine radio. A 60-foot luxury yacht, the Serenity, was overdue. A wealthy family from Miami was on board. A father, mother, and 2 young kids. They'd gone out for a weekend trip and hadn't returned. The Coast Guard was conducting air searches and asked any vessel in the area to keep an eye out. We were about 20 miles from their last known position. It was a clear, sunny afternoon. The sea was calm, perfect conditions. It was my first mate, a young Cuban kid named Manny, who spotted her. "Sam, over there, a yacht, it's adrift." It was the Serenity. We approached cautiously, sounding our horn. No response. The yacht was pristine. No signs of damage, no distress flags. The sails were furled, the engine off. It looked as if the family had simply decided to stop in the middle of the ocean for a swim. But there was a heavy, strange silence around it, a silence that seemed to absorb sound. We decided to board, me and Manny. The cabin doors were unlocked. We stepped inside. The scene was surreal. It was like the people had simply evaporated in mid-action. There were half-eaten plates of food on the galley table, a glass of wine, still full. Toys were scattered on the floor. Everything was in perfect order, just empty. We went from room to room. The beds were made, clothes were folded in the drawers. The family's wallets and jewelry were sitting untouched on a dresser in the master stateroom. This wasn't piracy. There was no sign of a struggle, not even a chair out of place. On the coffee table, we found one of the children's drawing pads. Most of the pictures were of boats, fish, normal kid stuff. But the last one,
The last drawing was different. It showed the yacht and 4 stick figures representing their family. Above them, the sky was colored a sickly greenish black, and from the sky, thin black lines came down and connected to the stick figures' heads, pulling them up. The sun in the corner of the page had a sad face. The air began to feel heavy, charged with static. Our handheld radio started to emit a low, high-pitched whine. That's when we found the video camera on a tripod on the upper deck, pointed at the sky. The battery light was still blinking. I hit play. Most of it was footage of the family laughing, swimming. The final clip was only 15 seconds long. It was shot at night. The image showed the dark sky. Suddenly, an emerald green light pulsed, illuminating everything. The light wasn't from a boat or a plane. It looked like the sky itself was sick. Then a sound started, not a roar or a hum. It was a fast clicking sound, like a million metallic insects chattering. The camera shook violently and fell, recording the deck floor for a second before it shut off. As we stood there, paralyzed, that same clicking sound began to come from our own VHF radio on the real time, faint but unmistakable. Manny and I looked at each other, and the same primal terror was in our eyes. We didn't say anything. We ran off the Serenity, jumped back onto our boat, and cut the lines holding us to the ghost yacht. I pushed the throttle to max, fleeing that spot. We reported to the Coast Guard that we found the yacht, that it was empty. We left out the details. Who would believe us? They towed the Serenity in, and the official investigation concluded the family likely fell overboard and drowned. A freak accident. I know what happened. They didn't fall. They were taken, pulled straight up, just like in the child's drawing. I sold my boat, my house in Florida, everything. I moved to the mountains of Vermont, as far from the sea as I could get, and as close to the trees as possible, where I can hide. I don't look up anymore. The sky isn't a vast expanse of freedom to me. It's a ceiling. And sometimes I get the terrible feeling that there's something on the other side, looking down, hungry, with its clicks and its sickly green light, just waiting for the right time to go fishing again.